Today we are going to practice marking the text using our Elizabethan age article. There's lots of different ways to mark the text. There's not like a right or wrong, this is the correct answer type of thing. But basically the point of marking the text is to make sure that you're understanding what you're reading. So it's easy to read a page and then say, yep, I read it, but you don't really know what you read. So marking the text ensures that we're really comprehending and kind of breaking down what we're reading and picking out the important pieces. So the first thing that we're going to do when we mark the text is number our paragraphs. So we'll just start with 1. The second paragraph is 2, and then the third is 3. Okay, so that's pretty basic. But when we get to these text structures like these boxes here, they get letters. So this is box A, and this paragraph, come back, is A1, and this paragraph is A2. Okay, so then we move down here to paragraph 4 about King James, and then we have another box, so that's box B, paragraph B1 and B2. And then we have paragraph 5, box C, C1, C2, and C3. So the reason that we mark our paragraphs or number our paragraphs is so when we're talking about a certain paragraph, everybody knows exactly where we are. So I can say, well, you can see in paragraph 2, and we all know to go to paragraph 2. So if we're consistent with that, we are better off. Okay, when I mark the text, I like to circle the names of people, places, and like dates, and then I underline the important facts. So again, there's not one right or wrong answer of marking the text. This is just an example of what it might look like. So, Shakespeare lived during a remarkable period of English history, a time of relative political stability that followed and preceded eras of extensive upheaval. Okay, so Shakespeare is a name, so I'm going to circle it. And he lived during a time of political stability. So things were like okay when he was alive. But it followed and preceded eras of extensive upheaval. So if you remember when we talked about Queen Mary, she was like a bad lady, right? So bad things happened when Queen Mary was alive. Queen Elizabeth, things got better. King James was okay, and then it went downhill from there with King Charles I and II. So that before and after Queen Elizabeth was not so great. Queen Elizabeth I became Queen of England in 1558, which was Shakespeare's, or when he was, before he was born, 6 years before he was born. And then she had a 45-year reign. So she wasn't murdered or anything like her sister, so she was able to reign for a really long time, so she must have done a good job. And then London became a cultural and commercial center. Learning and literature thrived, and England developed into one of the major powers of Europe. So I'm going to say London thrived. England was a major power. I'm actually going to circle England. Okay, so looking back on this paragraph, kind of the gist was Queen Elizabeth I, QE1, helped London thrive. So now when I look back at this paragraph, I don't have to read the whole thing again. I can just take note of what I circled and underlined and my notes in the margin and kind of have a general idea. And I don't have to go back and read every single word. All right, paragraph 2. When Queen Elizabeth ascended the throne, there were violent clashes throughout Europe between Protestant and Catholic leaders. So let's talk about these two words, Protestant and Catholic here. So Catholic is a type of Christianity, right? And Protestants were basically people who were also Christian, but they maybe thought that the Catholic Church was corrupt, or they disagreed in some way or another with what the Catholics believed in. So there was a guy named Martin Luther who kind of got this whole thing started, not Martin Luther King Jr., but Martin Luther, who created the Lutheran form of Christianity. So Lutherans are from Martin Luther. They're still Christian. They still believe a lot of the same things as the Catholics do, but Catholics have just some different ideologies that Protestants didn't necessarily agree with. And so Catholics didn't like that. They didn't like being, put on the spot or kind of like accused of doing things that they didn't feel like they did, or that they thought everything was fine. So anyway, Protestants and Catholics did not like each other. And it was kind of Queen Elizabeth's job to make sure that they didn't fight and kill each other. So Queen Elizabeth was Protestant because her father was a Protestant as well. So she honored many of the Protestant edicts that her late father, King Henry VIII, did. And she basically kept the peace between the Protestants and the Catholics. However, when compromise was not possible, she was an exacting and determined leader, and she would not shy away from conflict. So if something was going wrong and she needed to step in and put her foot down, she did. She was not afraid of saying, "No, quit it, I'm the queen and you will listen to me." With the naval defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588, England was firmly established as the leading military and commercial power in the Western world. So there's dates and stuff in there, but I don't think that sentence is super important. Elizabeth supported and later knighted Sir Francis Drake, the first sailor to circumnavigate the globe. She also funded Sir Walter Raleigh's exploration of the New World, which brought new wealth to her country in the form of tobacco and gold from Latin America. So remember, the Renaissance was a time when people were exploring the New World and they were going out and finding new discoveries. So Sir Francis Drake and Sir Walter Raleigh both did this under Elizabeth's reign. Paragraph 3 says, Queen Elizabeth also recognized the importance of the arts to the life and legacy of her nation. She was fond of the theater, and there were many playwrights of her time, including Christopher Marlowe, Ben Jonson, and William Shakespeare. Okay, so they were the important guys during that time. And then with her permission, professional theaters were built in England for the first time. So up until this point, if you were an actor or you were in an acting company, you would travel around the country and people would come to your shows. Well, finally, they decided to build theaters like the Globe in London, and people would come to them. And so about 15,000 people would go to the theater in London every single week, which was pretty impressive. Okay, back up to box A here. We're going to talk about Elizabethan society and class structure. So Elizabethan society was based on a system of precedence and one's preferment status. So they had classes like the upper, middle, and lower classes, and then also the king's view of you. So if you were rich, you were a member of what was called the nobility, probably. Or you could be poor, and if the queen or king really liked you for some reason, you could also be a member of the nobility. And so it sounds like a great thing, but it wasn't always super fantastic. We'll get to that in a second. The real growth in society developed within the merchant class. So the economy was really good. People who made things and sold them in stores were thriving. And this was the point when people could maybe not have to stay in that lower class forever. They could work their way up and become rich eventually if they worked hard enough, which was not the case for a lot of people in the past. All right, in Elizabethan England, there were new nobles and old nobles. Most of the new nobles were Protestant, and most of the old nobles were Roman Catholic. Okay, so they did not get along with one another. It may be tempting to view the nobility as the idle rich, but that was not the case. The high offices granted by the queen often brought financial burdens. So the honorific titles were not paid, and when a foreign dignitary visited England, you might have to house them if you were a member of the nobility. This was expensive, and although it was an honor, maybe it wasn't always that great. Okay, so if I'm poor but the queen likes me, I'm a member of the nobility, and she might not get that this could cost me my year's salary to put her up in my house when she comes to visit, because you want to give the queen the very best. So you got to make sure she's fed well. You got to make sure she has, the nicest things. And it's not like you could turn her down. You can't say, "No, sorry, queen, you can't come stay at my home." And so this could be a huge burden to people when she came to stay with them. So nobility sounds like a good thing, but it wasn't necessarily always so great. Okay, so King James the First became king after Queen Elizabeth died, and he was a writer and a playwright himself, and so he really loved the theater, and so he kept the theater going. After Queen Elizabeth died, Lord Chamberlain's men became known as the King's Men, and they produced plenty of new plays under his patronage. King James is most well known for commissioning the translation of the Bible from Latin to English. So one of the problems that Protestants had with Catholics was that they had to sort of believe, if they didn't read Latin, they had to just believe that this is what the Bible said because the Catholics told them that. And so that was a problem. And if you couldn't read Latin, you couldn't read the Bible. And so King James said, hey, that's a problem. And we need to make sure that everybody has access to this Bible. So if you're a Christian today, the version of the Bible that you read is the King James Version. So that has become the best-selling and arguably most influential book in the world. So fun fact there. King James was responsible for that. Okay, then we talk about religion. So Queen Elizabeth was Protestant, and she kind of... religion was super important to her, I guess. So religion was central to the society in which Shakespeare wrote, and Queen Elizabeth made attendance to the Church of England services mandatory. So everyone had to go to church each week, even though it may have been really far for some people to travel. It didn't matter. People who did not attend were often punished with fines. Unless you were sick, you had to go to church. Well, if you think about it, if I'm super poor and the church is really far away from my house, I might not be able to afford to get there. Well, then I get a fine for not going to church, and now I'm going to be even more poor. So this is one of Queen Elizabeth's things that is like, maybe not so great. Okay, it was not a crime to be Catholic in England, but it was kind of like you can be Catholic, but don't talk about it. Okay, there was no legal way for Catholics to practice, and it was illegal to hold Mass. However, powerful people were less likely to be punished. So if you're powerful or rich, the rules didn't always apply to you, and you could just hold Mass in your homes, and you could get away with it. Okay, so the rules didn't always apply. Then King James, while he was a good guy and he was nice with like the theater and stuff, he maybe didn't make the best life choices. So King James surrounded himself with untrustworthy advisors, and his extravagant lifestyle strained the royal finances and the patience of the Puritan-controlled Parliament. So Parliament didn't hate King James to the point where they killed him, but they probably weren't too sad to see him go. And when he died in 1628, his son Charles I took over, and tensions were so high that eventually there was a bloody civil war in which the king was executed at the end of the war. So King Charles was put to death. After that, King Charles II, King Charles I's son, fled to France. They just killed his dad, so he needed to get the heck out of there, right? And so for 12 years, the Puritans basically ruled. There was no king or queen, so Parliament just took over. And if you remember from our talks in the past, Parliament does not care much for the theater, so they closed those theaters down. This Commonwealth, as they called it, lasted for about 12 years until King Charles II decided, hey, I need to come back and reclaim my throne, and he installed what was called the Restoration. So he made an attempt to bring back theaters and to make it what it was when Queen Elizabeth was alive. But at that point, William Shakespeare had died, Christopher Marlowe was gone. It just never really got back to what it was when Queen Elizabeth was in power. The last thing we're going to talk about is education in the Elizabethan age. So boys were educated differently than girls. So boys were educated to be useful members of society, and they relied heavily on memorization and recitation. Okay, so they had to learn the facts. There was no Google back then. The language of literacy throughout Europe was Latin. So if you were a boy in school, you were expected to learn Latin. You started grammar school at the age of 6 or 7. And your typical school day went from 6 a.m. to 5 p.m. So that's a long day of class. And you never got out of line because discipline was very strict, and they used corporal punishment, which means they could physically punish you if you were bad. So boys were probably pretty well behaved in school. In the upper grades, they learned poetry, and for the most part, you would be done with school after grammar school, and then you would go on to learn a trade. Unless you were a son of the nobility, then you may attend university. School was very different for girls. So unless you were a child of the nobility, you probably didn't go to school at all. But those of them who were educated in chastity and the skills of housewifery. So young girls from wealthy families maybe would go stay with another wealthy family and learn how to maybe read or write, keep the accounts and manage the household and estate, and make medical salves for sick children, I don't know. And then they were probably taught to sing or dance. So boys learned to read and write, girls learned to sing and dance. Those were the priorities of Elizabethan England. Okay, so while no one could argue that the Elizabethan England presented the greatest opportunities for education, it did get better. And so by the 16th century, at least 1/3 of the male population could read. So we get that it wasn't super great back then, but eventually the Renaissance did make it get better. People realized we need to learn a little bit more and we need to improve our education system, and so they did. So that is marking the text for the Elizabethan age.